All right, let's see about that. Good morning. Yeah, welcome to the second talk on the second day, or the second slot on the second day. What are we going to talk about? We talk about GitHub Actions. So let me start with a question. Just in case, I want to ask you for a show of hands. Who has a hand that you can show? Okay, there are many hands, so that's great. Who here knows about GitHub Actions? Well, that's a lot. Who is using GitHub Actions? Okay, on a regular basis, let's say at least weekly. Okay, from these folks, who knows what this guy has to do with GitHub Actions? Okay, so at least that thing you will learn today, so we'll come to that again. And if you're wondering what that guy has to do with GitHub Actions, so yeah, as said before, I'm Thorsten. I came all the way from Germany, just across the border, so I'm living really close to Frommen and Venlo. I'm a principal engineer at site. I've been working with WordPress since 2005, and I learned about WordCamps and the WordPress community in 2014, so it's over 10 years now, which is just fantastic with, the pandemic and stuff, but yeah, still. I actually have been to more WordCamps in the Netherlands than in Germany, at least in the last 5 years or so. And also during my work over the last 2.5, 3 years, I did a lot of GitHub Actions things. So writing actions, writing reusable workflows, migrating a legacy GitHub app to a set of workflows and things like that. And this talk is about all the things that I picked up, which for me were new, were eye-opening, were just things I didn't think I should do, and then learned, well, maybe you should, or you should understand when you should, or when you want to do specific things. So I actually think that a lot of you will have more questions after the talk than now, but hopefully you also have the keywords to either find the answer yourself, because sometimes it is finding your answer, not the answer to a question, but also we have questions and answers time here, and I will be right after the talk in the community corner for questions, so feel free to find me. So yeah, let's start. What is GitHub Actions? Essentially, this is a CI/CD platform. It's a system for running continuous integration and deployment, development. So this is automating workflows, specific tasks lined up to build your code, build your application, test your code, and deploy it to somewhere. It allows to streamline development directly from your GitHub repository. So the first two things are not really new, because there are multiple CI/CD platforms, but this one is integrated into GitHub. That means, for example, if you push codes to your Git repository hosted on GitHub, you can kick off a workflow. If you open a pull request, if you label an issue, if you release or create a release of a version or so, that all triggers or can trigger a workflow. And also this guy. There is a Golem event that is being fired when a wiki page is being updated. I think that is because there is a Golem wiki flavor. I don't know if GitHub used that or so. I don't think they use it right now, but still that thing exists, which is just fun. So why would you want to use GitHub Actions? Again, it's about automating things that you always want to do in the exact same order, things that you always want to do or have happen and don't want to forget about. You can set up a lot of custom things and basically use the system for whatever you want. And also, again, it's built into GitHub, so there's no setup required. You can customize things, you can set specific things up, but if you have a GitHub repository, the CI/CD system, the platform, is ready for you to use. And also, there is a large collection of ready-made things for you to use. That could be like actions that are parts of your workflows, that are workflows in and of themselves. So you basically just say, I want to do the exact same list of things that that other company or that other person does, and you just reference them. So how do you use them, or how does it look like when you use GitHub Actions? Essentially, a simplified version of that looks like this. So the whole box is a workflow. We have this event on the top left corner. That could be, for example, a Golem event when someone updated your wiki page. You have then multiple tasks that you kick off, and they are called jobs. And for each job, there is a runner. That is a virtual machine somewhere You set it up, you decide what is that server running, and then that executes multiple things if you have. These runners, or these jobs, happen in parallel, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is a simple workflow. We start with this event that triggers the workflow. So if you push code, if you commit code and then push that up to your online repository, this workflow is being executed. We have in the jobs section, we have just one job. It's called GitHub Actions demo. And then inside we have steps. The first one is I execute a bit of code. The second step is I use an action that exists somewhere. So this actions checkout is a GitHub repository vendor or organization and package name slug. So that repository contains the code for this action to run. And then I run some code again. What can you use GitHub Actions for? Well, a lot of things. You can check any kind of statistics on your code. Does it comply to specific best practices? Does it comply to my formatting and opinionated rules? Depending on your technology, you can compile or build assets or even your application if you need to like have source code and you have a target artifact that you're building or so. You can execute tests, and this does not only mean things like, oh yeah, you have code and you can write, for example, a unit test or maybe even an integration or functional test. That could also be a performance test or accessibility tests or visual regression tests, whatever you want to do with that code, which could happen before or after deploying the code to some other server. And again, yes, you can deploy code somewhere. And now I would like to ask maybe 2 people or so, what are you using GitHub Actions for, which is not the high-level things that I already covered? Does anyone have anything? I just can repeat that. Yeah, Alex.
404 link checker.
404 link checker. Okay. You use that on the production environments after.
It's like on an awesome something page, and it checks upon every pull request, like if the links are still valid.
Okay, so you check on every pull request if links on online systems are still valid. That's great. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, so that we have a high-level understanding, let's get to the tips that I learned and some best practices that I follow. But there's a warning. I planned this to be a 4-hour workshop and then learned this morning that I have 30 minutes. But that's not an issue. I learned that this kind of presentation is called shotgun buffet, so that's what we're going to do. So I will hit you with a lot of snippets, and again, you already know them, or you may have heard the keyword and now you understand a bit of context and you can figure things out. So yeah, let's start. As I said, multiple jobs. We have the lint, the coding standards, and the static analysis jobs. They all happen in parallel. Sometimes you want things to happen in sequence. So this is one job. It's called PHP Quality Assurance, and we have 3 steps. And the first step is linting. When that's done, the second step is started. If the first step fails, nothing happens. So the second and whatever else is there does not happen again. Coming back to the first example, sometimes you want to have both, right? So for example, looking at the coding standards and static analysis, they don't have a lot of overlap. But maybe you don't want to run any of these on broken code, on invalid PHP, for example. So maybe what you want to do is lint the code, and then if it's valid code, there's no syntax errors, no anything, you do coding standards and static analysis in parallel. And that could be done like this. So we have a name, we have an ID for the first job, it's called lint. And then we say for the others, this one can run as soon as it can, and that's my only requirement. I need this lint job not only to be executed before, but actually to succeed, to be successfully executed. Another thing you may want to do is setting a timeout. By default, this is how it looks like. So it already indicates that this is a timeout in minutes. There's no other way to do that. So it's not timeout in whatever. It is always timeout minutes. So for example, 15 minutes. By default, the timeout for a job is 6 hours. And that could be a problem. Because that is eating your minutes, your budget. And even if you say, I don't mind, because I'm only doing, I don't know, 2 or 3 things, and I have 3 minutes, that's not an issue, this will prevent other workflows from starting. But also, the whole timeout for a workflow is 35 days, just so you know. If you need something to run for longer, you have to tell GitHub for that. I don't know how that number comes to be. You can set a timeout on step level as well. Sometimes that's easier, sometimes that's better. You could also do both. Set a timeout for your whole workflow, for the job, and then for the steps. You can also prevent something from eating your minutes, your budget, if you no longer want this to run. So for example, it happens to me and I guess some other people, you code something up, push it up, and then this workflow starts. And then you realize, oh my god, I forgot something. There should be an exclude sign, a negation, for example. You do that, push it up, and then see, oh my god, I hit the exclamation mark twice. Fix it again, push it up. So this 3 times triggered a workflow, and these workflows will run. But if I'm doing PHP unit, if I'm doing Psalm or whatever, I don't want them to run. It's not that much, but it could be other things. It could be more longer running, more expensive workflows. So you can tell the GitHub system, the GitHub Actions system, that this workflow, so this is in every of your workflow files, you can add that. You say, for this workflow, I want any kind of workflow queued up or in progress to be cancelled if there is a newer version of that exact thing. But also, because this is like, it's YAML and this is being interpreted and it's like a powerful, well, sort of powerful language, in line 3, that true doesn't have to be a true, like a value. It could be an expression. You could also say, I want to cancel in progress things if the GitHub ref, and for example that could be a branch, if you push to a branch, does not contain release. So that essentially means I don't want to cancel workflows on my release branch for whatever reason. And that's always for you to decide when that is a good thing and how you want to dictate should that be cancelled or not. Another trigger is scheduling workflows. So we said before, push codes, label, create a pull request, that is all user initiated. Sometimes you want things to happen based on time. So you can use the cron syntax, specifying UTC times. So in YAML, sometimes you need to single quote, sometimes you need to double quote strings. In this case, and sometimes you don't need to quote them at all. In this case, you need to quote them because the asterisk sign is a special character in YAML. So yeah, this is how it will look like. And examples for that are, at our company, we have a repository where we build stubs of WordPress core. Why do we do that? Because we want to be more defensive and we want to be more dictating what types to pass to functions. Sometimes you can do that by using PHP doc, but we would like to have that actually available for our Psalm or PHP stand setup. So every time WordPress releases a version of, I think we support the latest 10 majors and then all the patch releases for that or so. We look for new WordPress versions, download them, and then pass them through our stubbing logic, and then we have them all available here. And we, of course, don't want to always remember, oh yeah, there was a fixed release, someone could please trigger that. We just run that on, what is it, I think for us it's every Monday or something. If there was no WordPress release, then yeah, this is done in like a second or so. If there was, we download that, do it once, and then it's available in our repository for us. Another example is, who here knows about Dependerbot? Okay, that's a lot. Sometimes you want to do something like Dependerbot, but for private repositories or for sources of your dependents that Dependerbot has no access to or doesn't know about. So basically what you could do is you write your own Dependerbot workflow. Check using Composer, using whatever dependency management tool you're using or package management tool, is there a new version? And then also code into your workflow what kinds of updates do you want to pull in and what should happen. Do you update some specific branch? Do you create a pull request or things like that? That's also possible for scheduled workflows. Sometimes you want to manually run a workflow, and that is not manually trigger using, for example, an empty commit, which is not great, or opening a pull request and close it down. You really just want to execute the workflow. That could be for testing, but sometimes there are other valid reasons. And that's how this looks like. So I didn't say it before, a workflow cannot only have a single event that triggers that, it could be multiple. So if you want a workflow to be able to be manually executed, you need to include this workflow dispatch event. That will look like this. So on the top right-hand corner, we have this run workflow button or dropdown, which by default is not there. Now it is, and you can say even from what branch, if you have multiple, you want this workflow to be executed. Another good example is workflow call. This means that another workflow file is allowed to execute, or let's put it another way. One workflow file is allowed to execute another workflow file that has this event as a trigger. So that allows for things like reusing parts of your logic that you have in one workflow setup. That could look like this. You execute one workflow that receives payload, like what user triggered that on and which context branch, and I don't know. And this is passed to the other to the other workflow. You can also specify inputs and outputs so that these workflows can talk to each other or even to the future, like whatever happens next. And that's a very simple example. So we have this my workflow. This is, for example, triggered on, let's say you push some code. And then we see here in line 5, this uses as one step the GitHub workflow's my reusable workflow. And as you can see here with the starting dot, this is a relative path in this repository. So I'm executing this other workflow that has just the workflow call trigger, but again, it could have others as well. Sometimes you also want to have even more abstraction and also some kind of abstracting and blackboxing things. A composite action is essentially an action which at the moment there are 3 kinds of actions that you can use. One is JavaScript, that's the default. Then there is a Docker-based setup, so you can pull any kind of Docker container and build something and then execute, and that's the context of your action. And then the third one is a composite action, which essentially means you use YAML just like you write a workflow file and define the overall sequence of things that would happen. But this whole composite action is exposed as a single item in all the workflows calling them. So that could be a very complex, maybe even including a lot of conditional code and I don't know. And you, in your consumer workflow, you just see, yes, I want to use that composite action. And then you see it starts, it failed, or it starts and it's done and you don't know what happened. Sometimes that's good, but also this has to do with, for example, caching and reuse, and the virtual machine, the runner, is actually being reused, so it's also quicker. Yeah, this is similar to before where we had the workflow and the reusable workflow. So we have this composite action. It has to be in the folder .github actions, some name, and then the file has to be action.yaml. Workflows, you can call whatever you want, and then you, GitHub parses them and you can choose them. And an action is always, there's one action definition file in a folder. My slides are online, I will share the link later. So here are 2 very good blog posts about why you should use composite actions and what that could mean for you, your organization. Another thing, well, sometimes things just don't work, right? Things should work, sometimes they don't. So we need to debug the workflows. You can try and debug locally. It doesn't always work, it doesn't always work well. Sometimes you actually have to debug something in your actual GitHub context because that's where it fails for some reason. Could be to do with GitHub permissions or something else. So the first thing that you have to do is enable the debug logging. That's a link you can click, and at the bottom there's also documentation for that. And then you can also sometimes rerun a failed or a failing or also a successful job in debug mode. So that means that you see additional output depending on the workflows and actions that you use, whatever they output for debugging purpose. And this is actually what you can also do. You can write debug messages. So this is kind of a strange syntax. So you echo, you print something to the terminal following specific syntax, and then this basically will not be printed to the terminal, but it will only be printed in debug mode. That's a simple example. So this will not do anything in the CI output unless you run that in the debug mode. Another thing that you sometimes want or have to do is think about failing scripts, like bash scripts that you execute. If in line 7, some command that fails, well, that's what the name is, it fails, nothing after that will be executed. If a step or if code run in a step fails, then the whole workflow run fails. Sometimes that's good, sometimes not. Sometimes it's good, but you want to do something in between. And one thing that you could do is tell GitHub Actions what kind of shell you want to run. By default, the shell definition that's being executed is bash-e, so the pipe fail setup of that, which essentially means if this bash executes a command that fails, the entire execution is being failed. Sometimes you don't want that, so you can say, yeah, well, I just want to pass that to bash and don't want to fail. You still know about the exit code, so for example, what you could do is you execute on line 7 this some command that fails, you capture the output code, the exit code of that command, and then you have some logic. Maybe you want to do something if it fails, something else if it didn't, or whatever it is that you do. There's a lot of things or places where GitHub Actions and workflows can talk to you as an end user, can write information. One is annotations. So you can write inline messages to any file, and I guess that this is what a lot of people have seen, right? So you have some check on code that you push to a pull request, and then you see inline comments on this line is not conforming to your coding standards, or I don't know. You can do that as well, of course. So you can write a notice type, a warning type, or an error type message to any line or group of lines of code. And you can also pass some information like title and other things. This is how that could look like. And here's a simple example. So if we execute this workflow file, we note our readme.md file, also we annotate our readme.md file. The first line will receive this emoji that's in love with our documentation. And this is something that I actually built using that, or this is how I stumbled across that. We wanted to run the parallel lint script that tells me if my PHP code has some issues. And that fails, the command fails if my PHP code has some issues, but I don't want it to fail. I want to be able to do something with that information. So what I did is I said in line 5, don't fail, please. Execute and let me decide what I want to do then. So I capture the output, which by coincidence or not, is actually really well defined so that I can use that. So for example, we saw before in, where is it? You can't see that really, but in line 9 at the end, we have this strange setup where I'm printing an error message to the file and I can read .file from the JSON output. And then I have the line on that file where parallel found something. And then I also have the message where parallel said, this is invalid syntax, or I don't know. So what this allows me to do is execute the parallel lint script and annotate any kind of information and then fail. You can also write job summaries. Your job could maybe do a lot of things. Maybe you annotate, maybe there is no output for the individual job steps, but you want to have like a job summary. That is something that's like important output or so for an end user to more easily see, or because it allows Markdown basically, so it has rich text capabilities. You cannot write fancy information to the terminal output, but you can to a Markdown target. That's how that could look like, and that's how it will look in the workflow output screen. Another thing that you may want to at least consider is pinning third-party actions or workflows. That is, what version of that, and again, this is also Git code, do you want to execute? The first version in line 3 uses a branch name. And as you know, that just means if there's a new commit, by the next workflow execution, you use that new commit automatically. The second one, V1, uses a tag, which could also be deleted and something else could be tagged again. So it is more secure, if you think, but could be tampered with. And the third one is actually a commit hash. So unless someone deletes the repository and brute forces their malicious code to end up with the exact same hash, which might take a while, you are pretty safe. I can completely understand if you say like, yeah, but what if I have a lot of workflows and I have a lot of dependencies and they are being well maintained, so there is a lot of updates all the time. That's true. What you could do is you could abstract that into a reusable workflow for yourself. So instead of saying, I have this step, like one job that is using 3 steps of 3 dependencies, and you have to update all your repositories, all the workflow files, all the hashes, you can say, I have an organization-wide lint workflow. And that's the only place where you have to check, okay, is there an update? Is it safe? Do I want to use that or not? And you could even have multiple versions of your workflow, allowing for third-party version compatibility. Another thing about security is permissions. The GitHub workflows are being executed by some machine user that has permissions according to a token that is being passed. And you can override the permissions. That's the whole list of permissions and the values that you can set. And sometimes you may actually want to start with that. And then you see this workflow was not successful because it tried to do this, but didn't have permission. And then maybe you figure things out, and then in the end, that's all you need. That's something that you can easily do again in your like abstracted reusable workflow. You could specify the permissions on the workflow level. So this is the entire workflow file. So this is the root. We have the name and then the event, and then we have permissions. Or you can do that on a job level. So this is just a fragment of the file. Another thing that is great is if you push code and you want to execute specific things, but they only need specific kinds of changes. For example, linting PHP files shouldn't happen if you update the markdown, like readme.md or things like that. That is possible for, like, these path filters are possible for push and pull request and pull request target. You can also ignore paths, and that's how this looks like. So let's say the trigger is if I push code, and then we have more information for that. If there is a PHP file, but maybe not in the tests folder. That's then being, like if that's the case, I update my main plugin file, for example, that's a PHP file not in the tests folder, this workflow will be triggered. But there's a problem. Using branch protection or repository rule sets or so, you can say, I want, in a specific branch context, one or multiple workflows to be required to be ran and to succeed. The problem with that is GitHub checks if this workflow should be run. Like this, what we saw before, let's go back. This is checking if a workflow file should be executed, right? So this is not runtime of the workflow, this is runtime of the runner. So if there is no file being pushed that matches that, GitHub says, well, yeah, I don't need to run that. And of course, if you don't run something, it didn't run successfully. So if you have a pull request for a branch where you have this requirement set up, this will never happen. It will be waiting for the workflow to be executed. So what can we do about that? We can push the check into the runtime of the workflow. There is a fantastic action that's called paths filter. And this looks really wild, but you don't have to do that much, but you can. So what we do here is in line 6, that is part of my workflow execution. I say, I want to have a filter for composer files. So if the composer JSON file, line 11 and 12, all the composer log files being changed or pushed, I want this to run. And then I can check in line 14, for example, if the step paths, I don't think that, oh, it does work. So here, paths, this is referring to this ID. The step paths has an output, and that's not something that I define, this is part of this action here. It has an output, and again, composer is what I defined here, and then it says, yeah, something that you defined as this composer filter was changed, so yeah, that's true, I can do something. Or I can check, did it not capture something? I can do something else, for example. What's really great is, I had that highlighted, which would have made things easier. But yeah, you can also go really wild. Sometimes this is maybe a question of, does your workflow do too much? You could split things up, but just for illustration purposes. So I have multiple filters. They are called workflows, NPM, JavaScript, and styles. And here we see this ampersand workflows. This is essentially a target, like a hook that I define. What I can say is I have workflows, and these are the definitions. If my custom actions or my custom workflows are being changed, then the workflows thing was changed. For NPM, I want to execute some NPM-specific workflows if these files were changed, but also anything that was workflows. And again, for my JavaScript tests, I want to have NPM, which is everything. And yeah, this is really powerful. And you can check for all these filters, what was the case? What do you want to do? And that could look like this. You don't have to read that all. I'm just highlighting some things. So I'm checking here, is anything that I specified true or not? If not, well, don't do anything. I set up NPM. I check for JavaScript and then do the tests and yeah, some other things. User input is dangerous sometimes, and you shouldn't just trust, yeah, everyone is nice, so you shouldn't maybe do this. What we're doing here is we're passing a pull request title to a bash script, and that is not great, because it could look like that. Like you essentially execute whatever you can in this context. What could you do instead? You can pass the information to something else that could be either an input or environment variable, for example, and then the GitHub context makes sure that this is just a string. Whatever is in there, it will be what we saw here before, the string that has all of that. So if the string is using double quotes, then the double quotes around title are being escaped. The entire thing is just a string. What you also want to do is, because your workflow files are important, right? Because this is using quality checks. This is deploying code. So you better also check if the workflow definitions do not contain any errors, syntax errors, or things that you could update or improve. So you maybe also want to lint your workflow files. We offer a reusable workflow that's called lint workflows, and again, I have some links later on. That under the hood is using action lint. That's a Docker-based action that lints action YAML files and workflow YAML files. And it also has shell recognition, so it even understands that as part of your step for one job, you execute bash code, it can tell you you did something wrong or you did something non-ideal. We talked about Dependabot before. Actions that you reference from other repositories are, of course, dependencies of your code base, even though it's not production dependencies, but in your context they are dependencies. And of course they get updated. And Dependabot, because Dependabot is also integrated into GitHub, understands about GitHub Actions. And you can, just like you do with NPM packages or composer packages, you can say, I want to have this kind of approach to GitHub Actions dependency updates. Right, so that was the list of tips, best practices, and stuff. Some useful actions, or maybe actions that you already used before, is this list. Again, all of that is clickable. So you want to do specific things, like you want to, in your context, check out the code. You want to execute some scripts. You want to set up your environment, be Node, be PHP, or something else. Maybe you need to handle SSH access, so you want to handle SSH keys. Maybe you want to do specific things in a very specific context. For example, from 10up, deploying code to the .org plugin repository. Maybe you want to sync branches based on whatever. So for example, if you have if you follow the development approach that you have a development branch, a staging branch, and a production branch, and they map to environments, you want from time to time to reset the non-production branches to production, for example. Or if you want to spin up, if you change some code and you want to deploy that to development first, you can have a workflow that basically replicates what you did to the staging branch without you doing anything manually. Again, you can lint your code. So for example, from required, there's this lint action that supports various tools, does all the inline annotations, and yeah. What are you using third-party public actions that are not here on the list and would like to share? Anyone? Okay. Right. Next to actions, of course, we talked about workflows. As I said, you can make a workflow reusable. So you add this on workflow dispatch event. This is a short list of very good reusable workflows. For example, from the WP-CLI organization, in their .github repository, they have a collection of workflows that all the other WP-CLI package repositories automatically use. So that's the central place of workflow definitions. And then, yeah, there's a good, a very good workflows list. That's also interesting. Does anyone have reusable workflows, like, again, third-party public they want to share, or could maybe tweet, or I don't know what the verb for X is, or put on LinkedIn? Okay. Does anyone have any questions? And this is where you can find the slides. Thanks for. Oh, thank you.
Oh, everyone is taking photos. Sorry, if I'm. So over the years, you've seen things. People setting up the, using weird workflows, weird things to execute code. What is the problem? The weirdest that you
The
see?
weirdest thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's weird, but a really interesting approach that I found is using a repository to essentially run a script or a series of scripts on other repositories. There are, I think I know at least of 2 people or 2 repositories where you can go to that repository and check typos or check for typos in another target repository. And then this is telling people like, hey, your README is full of typos, and this is, I don't know, using some scripts, maybe even LLM, I don't know, like, yeah, this is maybe how you should formulate that or write, or that's just really just a typo. So that's something that's interesting. I don't think I remember anything weird.
You said like in 5-6 minutes you will be available for all the questions.
Yeah, depending on the queue in front of the coffee machine, I will be there. Right.
But you will also offer help.
Well, you have a question?
Since you mentioned the reusable workflow package, which is a public repository that site, has open source, can you name, or like, would it be possible for you to sort of click on that link and show what kind of actions or what kind of workflows we have developed that other agencies are sort of free to use or try out? Because, yeah, like, I'm part of the same company, so I'm aware of this. But if you just sort of see like reusable workflows, obviously that doesn't tell you what kind of things are in there. So maybe.
Yes. Yeah. So we're using WordPress scripts. Zoom. Right. So we're using WordPress scripts for any kinds of supported things. So that is checking our JavaScript or TypeScript code, checking our Sass CSS code, checking Markdown files, and we wrote workflows for that. The same for PHP. We're using PHP Code Sniffer with company internal standards. We're using Psalm for static analysis. We have I think we have two different ways to build artifacts from your source asset files. So of course, if we have Sass and TypeScript, your transpiled version of that is well, like old school JavaScript and CSS, and we don't want to include source files and assets in the repository. So we have workflows that on push to specific branches build the assets, commit the assets to that branch, delete the source files or resources for that, for example. We're using DDEV as a local development environment and Playwright for some testing. So there's a workflow for DDEV-based Playwright tests, and I think 2 or 3 more. One of the actions that we set up recently is setting up a VPN connection from within your workflow, also something that we needed to do in some client context, and essentially it's not specific to that client, so we made it a reusable thing.
I hear that's crazy.
Right. Okay, so maybe that is the weirdest thing, I don't know. Okay,
Thank you.
oh.
More questions over here?
Do you have experience with running workflows depending on who's pushing something, or like who's doing a pull request? Can you do like 2-stage things, like a new contributor would have different workflows be run than a maintainer? For community management, you know?
Yeah, so I think I saw it, I had that before, that there are different kinds of context environment variables that your workflow has access to. The GitHub context includes information about 2 people. One is, I think, the owner, the organization or individual of the repository, and the other one is the actor, like the one that triggered the workflow. You have information, I think, about the display name and their ID. If you want to differentiate between a new contributor or a maintainer or something, I think you would have to write a list somewhere. So similar to, for example, code owners or something. So as part of your workflow or reusable workflow or action, you would parse that information from somewhere and then just do matching. Like, okay, I see the actor is not part of my organization, for example, so it's an outside person, and then maybe you have a list of people who, I don't know, contributed code that was successfully merged for 3 times, which you somehow manually or in an automated way have to update. I don't think that GitHub Actions as a system understands like all these things about users, but it should be possible for you to write that. That's a really interesting thing, like treating people differently based on their experience, their affiliation, their I don't know, desire, perspective or so. That's really interesting.
Next question.
Yeah.
Well, it's not really a question, but I think there's a setting in GitHub where you can actually tell that you have to approve workflows from first-time contributors.
Okay.
So
I
that
did not know
if
that.
somebody pushes to your repo as the first time, you can say, I want to approve that before running
Okay.
any workflow.
That's cool. I know that GitHub knows that you are a new person. For example, if you open your first pull request, it shows you things, and after the 3rd one, it's gone. But I don't know. I didn't know where that information was exposed. Yeah, that's great. I will look into that. Thanks.
Cool. Nice. Let me get you your gift.
Right.
More questions?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's a very small, it's a community question, because I happen to know that there's this really cool,
I don't know, solution to also run or test or debug your workflows actually locally.
Act.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Have you linked that somewhere in your slides?
No, because I don't like it.
Oh, you don't like it?
It doesn't.
Fair enough.
It didn't work for the
Yeah.
context situations
Yeah.
that I tried using it.
Yeah.
Maybe I should link to it. Yeah.
It's a homework. It's a homework
Right,
for
yeah,
everyone.
exactly.
Okay. Getting the present. Okay. Yeah.
Small token appreciation.
Oh.
You guy.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Right.
Round of applause. Thank you so much. And it's a great presentation.